Iranians. I am going to disappoint you in one sense tonight. I noticed a splendid card announcing I was going to talk to you only about Iran tonight, but then somebody named Donald Trump came along last week and upended my speech title when he announced that the United States was unilaterally walking away from the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement that the United States during the Obama administration negotiated together with Britain, France, Germany, the European Union, Russia, and China, and which offered huge promise and way forward in the region. It is now not to be. And so I think we're brought to this point tonight, as much as it is a pleasure to be with you, that I have to bring less good tidings, not better tidings, and think with you for a moment about where we are in general in the Middle East and what we will be faced with going forward. And I do this because, once again, and not just because of the JCPOA, but the Middle East is back in the headlines, in part for the worst of reasons ourselves. Our decision to withdraw from the nuclear agreement, our decision, the President's decision, to move our embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, turning our backs on policies pursued by 11 presidents of the United States that in very disobliging times served us reasonably well and put us out in a position where we're not sure exactly where we're going to go in the future. And certainly no step taken to the visible advantage of American national interests in either case, the nuclear agreement or the Middle East. But I'm going to try to ask you to join me and do take a step back and think about where we are in this region, where the United States has spent so much blood, so much treasure, and so much time and attention, literally since the end of World War II. The crisis that we have seen, the crisis of the misnamed Arab Spring of 2010 and 11, is now 8 years old. But the turbulence in the region didn't just begin then. It began, for me, by my counting, in 1979, when the Shah fell from power in Iran and a revolutionary religious government took control of that nation's fortunes and began to position itself differently in the Middle East and attracted instantly the anger and attention of its Iraqi neighbors, and by the 1980s was engaged in a full-scale war in which rocketry, poison gas were used against Iran. A terrible shaking event that shaped Iranian thinking in a manner that we will live with for years to come, and that is Iran is a nation under threat. It's not only a long history of invasion, but in this generation's immediate sense of vulnerability, the Iranian nation, not just its government, lives with a sense of vulnerability. So we had 1979, we had 2010. There's another important date we must all keep in mind, for it was our date, 2003, the American decision to invade Iraq, in which we smashed a government on the ground, and that unleashed in its turn enormous tensions, and the shattering of Iraq was the direct precursor of ISIS, and we're still finishing with that particular fight. So if you think of a region that has been in turmoil, think of those 3 dates. 2010, with the Arab Spring, in which governments throughout the region collapsed, with the partial exception of the Gulf and North Africa. Governments throughout the area collapsed. And not only did they collapse, but Arab societies were convulsed in civil wars. And in so doing, the shattering and sundering of Arab societies, people retreated in the Arab world into sectarian definitions, ethnic definitions, along tribal lines, as people sought refuge from the turmoil and dangers of the region. It is that fall of governments and the sundering of the region's societies that we've lived with, in addition to the Iranian and American invasion of Iraq. And it's produced the huge turbulence that we face today. And so, what else has happened? Not only the political turbulence, but it brought about the rise of political Islam, of religious fundamentalism, and it broke down a hitherto existing balance of power in the region. From 1973 until the Arab Spring, and perhaps a bit later, the dominant force in the region was the United States. From the time we succeeded in outmaneuvering and organizing the end of Soviet influence at the time of the War of 1973 with Israel, the United States was the dominant. Everybody went to Washington power to seek solutions. Starting in the mid part of the last decade, that ceased to be the case. And as the chaos of the region, its turbulence, has spread, the balance that we used to assure has been filled in with the re-entry of Russia, with the arrival of Iranian power, with Turkey's own intrusion, and Europe to a degree, though Europe has been as much a victim as it has been a player in the events of recent years throughout the region. So here we stand today, 8 years after the Arab Spring, and more years after our invasion and the events in Iran. And we need to begin to take stock. Where are things? Is it all turbulent? Are events beginning to take some shape that we can look at in terms of American policy? Policies that were upended in the events of the turbulent period we've known? Can we begin to set new courses in our thinking about how to engage this region and help it make sense of itself? But most important of all, look out for our interests, take care of the United States. And as I take a look today at the Middle East, I'm beginning to see two basic trends emerging. The first is a gradual return to stability. The Gulf, as I noted earlier, stood firm, had to make serious changes in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and has had its own internal quarrels over Qatar. But basically, the Gulf withstood the temptations of the Arab Spring, and the Gulf governments spent a lot of money to maintain themselves in power. While others collapsed, they remained. But we've begun to see the return of other governments. You've seen the Egyptians in 2013. Like it or not, the Egyptian army, with massive public support, assumed power, expelled the Muslim Brothers, the religious fundamentalists, and took power in Egypt. And Egypt has been very different since 2013. A measure of stability that Egypt longed for has been restored. Iraq today, or over the last several days, has had a general election, unimaginable when we were only a short while ago looking at ISIS occupying a full third of the country. A general election was held, and the party that seems to be taking the lead in the outcome of that election, which is a Shia-dominated party, has received strong support from the Sunni regions that have been recently liberated from ISIS. Muqtada Sadr may not be the next prime minister, but he certainly is going to be the kingmaker in a future Iraqi government. But things are changing in Iraq. You can actually see a few green shoots coming up. In fact, if you're interested, you can travel to Mosul today and go to the main hotel in town and find yourself a bottle of Johnny Walker on the roof. Unimaginable when ISIS was still in charge of that town. But there is a direction in Iraq, and it has some hopeful elements to it. All the troubles are not over, but a newer and better future. Syria, the civil war continues, but it too is beginning to take shape. It does appear today that nearly 70% of the country is now recontrolled by the government in Damascus. Like Bashar al-Assad, or don't like him, he is reassuming control. And he isn't doing it just by force of arms or by his alliance with Iran and the Russians. He's doing it because a great many Syrians are prepared to serve in his army and to work to reestablish some degree of order from the chaos that has existed hitherto in Syria. Now, this is a lump for Americans to swallow. Are we prepared to live with a Middle East that reacquires stability? Are we prepared to live with that, or do the dreams that we had of the Arab Spring, of democracy spreading to every corner of the Middle East as if it was some replay of the Berlin Wall in 1989? Are we yet really prepared? If you pick up most of your American newspapers, you will find bitter broadsides launched against the Egyptian rulers, against Bashar al-Assad, and they are all well-meaning, and they reflect accurately a degree of repression that exists in Arab societies in restabilizing states. But let's be careful. What do people in the region want? Do they want chaos, or do they want order? And the first human instinct that expresses itself is to reestablish order. And if we are to find our footing in the region, that is a fact we have to accept and shape and deal with. Because the future does not mean it will all be gray. I've just returned myself from Egypt, and I was struck by not only the election in which Sisi won quite easily, but I was struck by the beginning of recovery of the Egyptian economy. I was struck by the huge advances of the role of women, particularly in government. 6 ministers, really smart ladies who have taken key portfolios in the government. The adjustment in relations between the Muslim majority country and the Christian minority. For the first time in my lifetime, Egypt is again allowing the construction of churches, the establishment of a new Coptic cathedral. And so things do change when stability returns. It doesn't mean it's a straight line to democracy. So let's play for the longer odds, I would argue, as a basis of American policy, and we'll see what other changes come about in that manner. This doesn't mean that the Middle East is on the verge of total security, stability. Of course not. That's not what I'm arguing. And I will specifically not argue that the evil threat of terror is beyond us. It has a very long tail. But terrorism in the Middle East is already taking shape, diminished shape, where it no longer has to be dealt with main force military and becomes increasingly a political, police, and intelligence matter, as the last of Al-Qaeda and ISIS are rooted out. It will take a very long time, and it will be finally defeated, if it is defeated completely, by political means. So stability is one key fact, and we have to adapt to it. The second basic change that's occurring in the region is the forging of a new balance of power. This is no longer a region that's going to be dominated by the United States and what Washington decides is in the region's best interest, and where regional leaders come to Washington, go to Camp David, and try to sort out their differences or their future. It's going to be a very different Middle East, in which the decisions reached there are going to have to be done with Russians and Turks and Iranians and Americans and Europeans around the table. And just over the horizon, the first serious expenditures of Chinese money will, in the short period in front of us, begin to put China at the table. In short, there will be powers at work in the region. Now, will they be at work for constructive purposes or for the selection of proxies in Arab civil wars? Today, unfortunately, the latter is the case in Syria. The Russians and Iranians have their proxies. The Turks have their enemies and the Kurds. We've had our proxies that we've supported, notably the Kurds, and the war has been fueled by proxies selected by the Saudis, the Qataris, many of the fundamentalists in the Syrian civil war. Is that the future of Syria? I don't think so. I think Syria will gradually come together. It won't be very pretty, but there is a chance that out of Syria's civil war there can be a different Syria, and in part it will be when there is an understanding between outside powers. Have we seen that begin to happen? John Kerry tried in 2015 putting together a Geneva conference to bring the outsiders and the internal factions together. It didn't work. The Russians threw their hand in, or picked up a fresh deck of cards in Astana in Kazakhstan and brought the Syrian factions together with Iran, with Turkey, with Russia, and they carried that forward into Sochi. It's still not produced an outcome, but the outsiders are beginning to circle the problem and try to find some balance in the interests between themselves. And in this new order that is emerging in the region, we will be inter pares, but not primus inter pares. We can continue to be players, provided we have clear objectives, we know what we want, where we're going, and are prepared to play. But I think there is perhaps out of all of this period a more basic question that we Americans have to ask ourselves. Do we really need to be in the Middle East? What are our interests there? How vital are they to our future? How much effect does the region and its problems have on the American economy? We've lived with a traditional set of assumptions with three core interests on the table. Number one, we believe very deeply that the United States had an obligation to preserve the security and independence of the State of Israel. And it became much more than a political commitment, it became a virtual existential commitment. It was a moral commitment on the part of Americans to assure the stability, assure the survival and prosperity of the State of Israel. Core American interest that has fundamentally affected our political system. The second key interest we had was hydrocarbons, the flow of hydrocarbons. For many years, we imported large amounts of oil from the Middle East, but so did Europe, and so increasingly did Asia. So it wasn't just the American economy that needed Middle Eastern oil, it was the global economy. And if, as in 1973, those of you like myself who remember standing in line waiting for a tank of gas, remember a disruption in petroleum supplies from the Middle East, it was a deeply, deeply troubling matter and drove us into a period of recession. That's clearly no longer the case. But the third reason the United States decided to involve itself in the Middle East was never clearly articulated as such, but we are a great nation and we have global interests. No nation in the history of the world has ever been able to secure its interests if it didn't have a stake in stabilizing the Middle East, which touches on every other region, on Asia, on Africa, on Europe, and its troubles always spill over borders and upset the global order. And so, to be a global power, you need to be a power in the Middle East, and so we said. Are those three reasons still as valid today? Israel is pretty able to stand on its own feet, sometimes much to our distress. If you watch the bloodletting on the Gaza border today and are as moved by it as I am, do we still have to worry about the survival of the State of Israel? I don't believe so. The region Israel lives in has been so weakened that it offers no serious threat to Israeli security, and I include the Iranians. Second, petroleum. The extraordinary revolution that's taken place, Robert, in Texas with the fracking, horizontal exploitation of oil, shale, and gas has radically transformed the American petroleum industry. We will be, I think, the world's largest petroleum producer this year, which is an amazing turnaround. And it will be in our favor for literally years and years to come. And our holdings of gas are even greater and promise huge benefits even to those of us as concerned as I'm sure all of you and I are about the environment. So we're no longer dependent. But that isn't to say that hydrocarbons aren't important to everyone else in the world. China depends on Middle Eastern oil. India depends on Middle Eastern oil. Europe depends on Middle Eastern oil. And if those economies aren't working, then our economy isn't working. So we have an interest. It's not as direct as it was, but it's still there. And in power terms, I argue that what goes wrong in the Middle East goes wrong for the world, and we need to be a player. So perhaps we're not as involved as we needed or thought we needed to be, but we're still involved, and I continue to argue the United States needs to be engaged. Now, what do I mean by engagement? I believe in the first instance, and I've tried to argue with you all, that we have an interest in making certain that in the short run, stability returns to Arab states. And in the medium and longer term, that we encourage, not try to impose, a different economic and political model and human rights model that makes Arab states more sustainable in the medium to long term. That does not mean it will be done with American bayonets, nor does it mean it will be done with Americans jawboning. But there are many ways we can encourage the growth of stable systems in the future, and that's where we ought to be. Quiet and modest about what we say, but determined. The second question we have to face is what kind of power role do we want to play? And I have argued the restoration of a balance of power is in our interest. If you go back and look at history, we were very careful between 1945 and roughly 2000 not to find ourselves nailed down in the Middle East, but to be the offshore balancer, able to intervene when a foreign power or external force intruded in the Middle Eastern scene and upset the balance. To enter with clear objectives, even including the use of force, and then withdraw. It was about the time we got involved in Iraq that we began to spread a permanent military footprint. We have large numbers of troops, 3,000 or so in northern Syria today. We have 8,000 or 10,000 in Iraq. We have bases in Saudi Arabia, the UAE. We have a fleet presence in Bahrain. We have American military on the ground throughout the region, and they are a target. And they also, their very fact means we often think if there's a problem, we should use them. Is it not better to return to another America, an America that was an offshore balancer, and we intervened when we had to, and left when we didn't have to stay on the ground anymore? But whatever we do in the region, however we seek to promote political understandings between ourselves, Russia, the Turks, on the one hand, and position ourselves militarily, there is no escaping the central problem the American government and nation faces today, is how we come to terms with Iran. Iran is a massive factor today, as it has always been in the Middle East. And to have no relationship with Iran, with which we have not had any diplomatic ties since 1979, to be at odds, as the president put us the other day when he, in effect, unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, is to mean that we've got our one hand tied behind our back as we try to deal with the powers that will shape the future of the region. I tried to make a point earlier that it is quite easy to describe Iran as a terrorist, malign, dissidence fomenting power. In the Iranian sense, if you look at it from their point of view, and the smart man looks at it from both points of view, they see themselves as a nation that is defensive, that has faced wars, that has a troubled region, that is at the target range of massive military build-ups in the Gulf and from Israel. And Iran sees herself quite differently as a nation that's under siege, and therefore a real reason for Iranians to develop ballistic missiles. I don't cite that as an excuse, but as an explanation. To deter your enemies, you have a method of making certain that they won't attack you. And so Iran is a key political player. It's a player in the civil wars of the region, particularly in Iraq and Syria. It is a potential guarantor of stability. It is a force for stability. It saved the Kurds and the government in Baghdad at the time of the ISIS attack before we could get to the battlefront. It is a key factor in trying to preserve the government in Kabul today. Think of Iran as a player, and if we're going to be relevant in the Middle East, we have to deal with all the actors, not just ones of our own choosing. And if I have to put my finger on a key structural problem in our approach to the Middle East today, is our decision to split and say we have friends, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and enemies in Iran. We have neither friends nor enemies. We should be right in the middle. Our interests are served when these contending forces find a basis to live with one another, a fact that we need to encourage. But the President has not accepted the fact that there can be a regional peace. There cannot be a regional peace without Iran. And the great tragedy of the decision to tear up our commitment to the JCPOA was to deny its ambition. The JCPOA was but a beginning. It was a floor. If it had carried forward, if our diplomacy and the Iranians had carried it forward at the end of the Obama period, we might have seen negotiations begin about other problems in the Middle East. But everybody stopped until our election was over, and now we have the result. So we're faced again with a new problem. A French diplomat recently said something that I found quite wise and striking when he looked at the current American attitude, government attitude towards Iran, that Europe is trying to cope with Iran in 2018. The facts of today. The Americans, on the other hand, are still fighting 1979, the fall of Shah, the takeover of our embassy. And it is in that dilemma that we find ourselves caught in the crosshairs. And so we've been pulled out of the JCPOA. And it is not without consequence, huge consequences, and they will play out over time. We are watching a rising confrontation between ourselves and Iran that didn't exist before. If Iran herself leaves the JCPOA, reintroduces centrifuges, increases its production of highly enriched uranium, we and the Iranians are on a direct path to a clash, and do not rule that out. If the Iranians withdraw from the JCPOA because they cannot secure an agreement from the Europeans, then they will go back to centrifuges and highly enriched uranium. Maybe not a bomb, but they will create enough concern in this country and on the outside that the chances of a confrontation will increase measurably. Confrontation with Iran. Under the shadow of our decision, we are now seeing intensified regional conflict. Watch what the Israeli Air Force has been doing in the wake of Trump's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal. Making its own, drawing its own red lines in Syria, telling the Iranians not to cross, bombing Iranian positions and Syrian government positions. The war has intensified across Israel's border into the Golan Heights and now up into central Syria. And in the Gulf, take a look what's happened in Yemen. The Saudis and UAE have started an offensive against Hodeidah to upset the rough balance that had been there between Houthi forces and themselves. So our decision has unleashed problems, and more can come. The third, and to me the saddest fact of all, the breakdown of the JCPOA has put us at cross purposes within the Western alliance and called into question our relationships with Western Europe. Today, Donald Tusk, the head of the European Commission, former Prime Minister of Poland, said if you need a hand from the United States, look to the end of your arm. If you need a friend, don't look to the United States anymore, not we in Europe. It's time for us to take matters into our own hands. We don't extract the slightest benefit from that degree of alienation. And the anger in Europe that the United States, which has unilaterally broken its word on the JCPOA, left an agreement that was secured in the United Nations Security Council, pulled out of that agreement, reimposed sanctions in the face of that agreement, is now saying we will sanction European companies which under their law and the Security Council are doing legitimate business in Iran. And if you don't think that causes anger among our allies in Europe, you've got something else to think about, because people are really angry. Now, what that anger will take is built on top of other facts. Our decision to turn our backs on the Paris Climate Conference, our decision to look the Europeans in the eye and badger them about defense spending, our decision, some of it merited, so our decision to talk about sanctions for steel and aluminum exports and broader trade disputes between ourselves. Europeans are looking back at a 70-year relationship with the United States and saying, and what kind of ally will we be as you look forward? So the Iranian JCPOA has now brought us into direct confrontation with the Europeans. It's done one other thing. There was an agreement started at the time of the NPT to try to contain the nuclear furies of this world and to negotiate our way through nuclear agreements. There's even a hope to get a nuclear negotiation going with North Korea. But now, in the wake of a unilateral decision on the part of the United States to destroy a negotiation about a nuclear future, where does the international non-proliferation system stand? The final beneficiaries of our disobliging action will be Russia and China. And there's no doubt that today Iran is digging in deeper with the Russians and with the Chinese, certainly not with us, strengthening and enabling their positions. So here we are, faced with a stark choice. And I can't tell you, I can give you a simple prescription of how we get out of this mess that we've created for ourselves. But I think events will decide whether the JCPOA survives, whether the Europeans are able to find ways to maintain their economic connectivity and the support structure under the JCPOA. It's certainly in our interest to argue with powers like Israel to proceed with great restraint when they look at the Iranians in Syria, and to be prepared to re-engage in peace talks in Geneva about a future of Syria. Those are lines you can pursue, but I'm not quite sure how we get ourselves back on track with Iran. And so I stand, ladies and gentlemen, tonight before you and say to you with all concern that we have fundamental questions, we as Americans, to ask about ourselves, the future of our foreign policy, including about the Middle East. Where does the United States want to be in this global order? Where do we want our power to be used? How do we want to protect ourselves? I will argue 3 quick points in conclusion. One is no nation makes its way in the world if it isn't a great nation, if it isn't predictable, it doesn't create a regime of trust around itself, if it doesn't create confidence in its word. And that today is very, very much at issue. Equally an issue is the value we attach to our alliances. Is it important that we have strong ties with Europe, an existing structure with NATO? Is it important that we have trading relations with Canada and Mexico? Or do we enter into a free-for-all? So the third point I would underscore is, do we really extract advantage as a nation in a world without rules? Rules that we helped write and that we, to our great peril, unilaterally walk away from. And finally, I think a real question we as Americans have to ask one another is, what is the use of force in this world? Do we preserve our way solely by military force or the threat or use of sanctions? Or have we underused the power and persuasion of our example and our diplomacy, backed up with military force, to try to help shape a better world for all of us to live in? Ladies and gentlemen, I've gone on at excessive length tonight, and I'm most apologetic, but you've got me thinking about a subject I care about a great deal, the future of this country, and I'm pleased to have a chance to talk to you about it. Thank you.
If everybody's willing to stay and you're willing to stay, we'll do some Q&A.
I'd be happy to answer questions, but I think I've overspoken my piece. In any case, if there are questions, please, sir. Right.
You described so many things that what I'm trying to understand is how much of what has changed is Trump, and how much of what has changed is what Trump represents.
And what was, I think that's a terrific question if everybody heard it. How much of this is Trump that worries me today, or have we been building to this point? I'm going to argue that a lot is Trump, but certainly not all. And particularly as I think about the last 4 points I've tried to make, the break point in my mind where we began to go unilateral and rely on American force came about roughly in 1989. George H.W. Bush, 41, was the last president that sought to build alliances. He went to Kuwait, if we all remember properly, and he drew a line around Kuwait where he had an international coalition. And he didn't go beyond that, though there were a lot of people saying, you've got to go to Baghdad, and you have to defend this, and you've got to defend that. And he basically stood firm and said, I do not have an agreement from the international community to go beyond. He knew restraint. And when the war was over, he pulled our forces out of the region and restored an offshore position. After that, because we had such dominant power, economic, political, military, on the world stage, we began to use it improperly, to my way of thinking. But for a reason. I've watched the mixture of American politics and American statecraft to the detriment of the latter. If you think about a politician, he stands up and runs for election and he promises you this, you that, all of us something that we want because he wants to be elected. A statesman has to prioritize where to use his power, where to use his resources, how to define strategy, grand national strategy. The two habits are quite different. And I have seen from the day we elected Bill Clinton, whom I voted for, the day we elected Bill Clinton president, to the present, we have tended to allow our politics to drive our statesmanship. And now we see it played out in spades over Trump's decision with the JCPOA and Trump's decision to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. All of these are driven with a political motive in mind to shore up his base or expand that base and bring in other figures into a political coalition he wants to have part of. So I think we've been heading down this road, and the road of the use of force as well, progressively, but we've reached a kind of very important moment now. And I think it's really worth sitting down, looking at ourselves and saying, is this the road we want to continue to travel?
We'll take two
Yes.
more questions if you want to take them together.
Right here.
Could
Please.
could you comment on the role of religion going forward? You didn't mention it, so.
I'm sorry, the role of
religion in the
of
area
religion.
of
Very
vision.
good point. Any other questions?
One more
On the
question.
way back, let me try the gentleman there.
I just wanted to ask your thoughts on some of the political and demographic changes in Iran itself.
Political and
where's the
changes in Iran. Got it. Okay, sir, you have a question.
Now, how would you rank Obama with regard to statesmanship vis-a-vis the Middle East?
Well, these are quite separate questions. Let me start with
In
the...
relationship to your comments
Let me,
about
right, I'm with you. So let me start with yours, the role of religion. It's a fascinating question. The Middle East is the most religiously defined region in the world that I know, explicitly religiously. Much due to the fact that they share all three monotheistic religions, all know they have a direct telephone line to God, and God tells them what to do. But I'm also going to argue that the history of the region has not solely been about confrontations between religions, but the overwhelming fact of the Middle East has been how religions have cohabitated, coexisted over centuries. That the natural impulse is to get along one with the other. If I mentioned in the Iraqi case that Sunni are voting for a Shia party, it's because Iraqis are fed up with religious distinctions. And then I think about the United States, and I say to myself, I don't want to be part of anybody's Sunni-Shia divide. I want to be right in the middle. And it's really much more, less about religion than it is about national ambition of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And there I want to be a bridge builder, not a religious definer. So I think religion is a fact. One has to live in the region. You're respectful of religion, but it shouldn't be a factor in your policy, not the policy of this country when we protect our interests in the Middle East. So back to the gentleman in the blue jacket, if my eyesight permits me to properly identify you. You know, I'm going to make 2 points. We've seen Iran convulsed in revolution in '79. We've seen several years ago a huge outburst in Tehran. 2 candidates for the presidency were nudged out by Ahmadinejad, and there was a lot of violence on the streets of Tehran. It was repressed. Not so many months ago, 6 months or whatever it is, there has been economic complaints that moved further into expressions of discontent in lots of rural areas in Iran. Really didn't touch Tehran as opposed to the previous one. I would say today, my best judgment is the regime sits pretty comfortably. It has a monopoly of force, and it has, when pressed from the outside, when Iran is criticized and attacked and threatened from the outside, Iranians pull together. And today, our president's decisions have caused Iranians to pull together. Unfortunately, this decision has weakened the more liberal reformist elements in the country in favor of the darker, more radical forces, the so-called principalists. So I don't see a problem immediately for the regime, even though Iran has massive economic difficulties to deal with. It has dealt with much worse and survived. It went through the Iran-Iraq war, it went through years of heavy sanctions, and it survived and it coped. So I don't write the Iranians off so easily, and I find our habit of saying it's the people waiting to rise up, I don't think I follow that. I particularly, in my second point, is I do not believe the United States should base a foreign policy on assumptions about other people's domestic affairs. We should base our foreign policy on the assessment of our interests and who we can make deals and arrangements with. If we try to second guess other people's politics, we'll get it wrong. And how about a country with which we haven't had diplomatic relations, academic ties, serious news feeds, deep insights for now 40 years, nearly 40 years? How do we know what's going on in Iran that we can make an assumption that the government's teetering or a few more American sanctions can cause it to fall to its knees? Isn't it more important that we try to figure out how we can deal with this government, where we draw red lines and where we accommodate, rather than sit around and second guess what's going on in their society? Sir, yours was the last question, and I think if I had it correctly, how did I stand and compare Obama and George Bush 41, if that's the question you asked me? Obviously, you've found someone who defended the record of 41. Obama was an incredibly smart man, and many of his instincts led him to question the overextension of American authority in the Middle East. But I think we'll look back on him as a transitional figure. For it was the same Obama that said Assad must go, as if we knew where Assad would go and what would follow him. As if we had a say about where the next president of Syria would be. The very president who said we should negotiate with Iran when it came time to really negotiate the civil war in Syria, left John Kerry sitting out at the end of a limb with no serious political support from the White House. And so I think I look back on the Obama years with a certain degree of ambivalence. I think he began to see you don't want to overextend American power, but hadn't quite figured out how to define its uses. And that still remains before us as a challenge. So those three questions, and I don't want to keep you.